So now I want to talk about some concepts that need to be considered when working with English language learners and testing. IDA has some pretty strict ideas about what you should be doing. You need to draw information from a variety of sources with different kinds um, of tests, including achievement and aptitude, but you also should have parent involvement, teacher recommendations, information about the child's physical condition, sociocultural background, and adaptive behavior. This is that whole idea that we've talked about assessment being a three-legged stool. Um, and so with that in mind, you should have data from the tests that are formal, observations, and qualitative data like review of records and interviews and observations. And interviews. All right, so again, that's not just best practice, it's also the law. So factors to consider in assessment: what is the current grade of the student? Current and previous types of educational programs. So the language proficiency, what language are they most proficient in? It could be L1, L2, and then English could be their third language. And was the child appropriately placed or not in an English language learner program? So a lot of times kids are placed in English language learner programs based off of um, either parental background interview, and I've seen these where this is, home language, and it says Inglés. I know it's not English. If it was English, you'd write English. But the parents are afraid to tell the schools that the kids, don't speak English at home because they think their kids are going to get penalized in some way. And so it is really important to find out, how was this child not placed in a classroom for English language learners? Was it based off of a parental survey? Did they actually do some sort of assessment? Was there a teacher scale? How was that determined? Review data in the school's records. What is the family history and background? You need to get information from the family if possible. And because many of these families for whom English is not their first language, they cannot read English forms. And oftentimes, if they're migrant families, they don't have transportation to and from the school as parents. The kids have buses, the parents do not. And so sometimes you're going to have to do a home visit. And if they don't speak the language that you speak, then they're going to have to do a home visit with somebody who's there to translate for you. So, what is the child's educational background? As I've said before, just can't assume that because the parent says, yes, he went to school back in XYZ country, that educational experience mimics the one here in the United States in any way. How did the child do? If they were doing well in another country, the parents like, yeah, he was struggling, there. That's a good sign that it's probably a disability and not a language issue. And what might the referral team have overlooked in terms of exclusionary clause factors, in terms of matching interventions, those kind of things? So the evaluation procedures, you need to measure whether or not they need special education services instead of some sort of English language learner services. For English language learners, this really is the main question that you have when you're doing these diagnoses. Does the child have a disability, or do they just need some sort of English language support like TESOL or bilingual ed? You need to conduct formal and informal language assessments. It's not good enough to have a parent tell you or a teacher tell you, yes, they're proficient, or no, they're not proficient in these various languages. You need to actually gather proficiency data on the child, directly with the child. Um, you need to evaluate if the primary cause meets one of the exclusionary clauses. You don't just check the box, no, no, no. In a report for a bilingual child or a multilingual child, and this is true for any child that could possibly meet any of the exclusionary clauses, you can't just say, no, they don't have language as their primary cause. You have to justify in the report how you evaluated that language was not the primary cause, how you ruled that out as the primary cause, and why you think it is a disability instead. And then you have to choose, how am I going to test this child? Am I going to test them in their first language, their second language, non-verbally, bilingually, etc.? So bilingual assessment is often done, at the same, so it's different than testing in multiple languages. So if you test in multiple languages, you would give, say, an English version of a test and then maybe a Spanish version of the test. So that example would be the Woodcock-Johnson. The Woodcock-Johnson has, the cognitiva and the cognitive. And so if on the cognitiva, if the child answers in English, they don't get credit for any answers in English. Even if they understand the construct, they don't get credit. And on the cognitive, if they answer in Spanish, they don't get credit for answers in Spanish. They either know it or they don't know it in that language. And so that is often confused as being a bilingual assessment because I gave it in two ways. The problem is some kids will know certain words in some languages and not in others. And so they're not really able to, if they can't integrate all of their knowledge, maybe you're not getting at their crystallized ability. So a bilingual assessment, a true bilingual assessment, is given at the same time. So, for instance, the KABC has several subtests that are bilingual. That the question can be asked in English or in Spanish, there's prompts for both, and the child can respond and get total credit in English and in Spanish. The BVAT, which is made by Woodcock as well, the Bilingual Verbal Abilities Test, is considered a crystallized IQ test. And you give the child the test in English, and then any item that they miss, you go back and give it to them in one of 16 possible languages. So that is considered a bilingual test. It's not necessarily given simultaneously, like they don't get credit right away, but the entire test, they get combined credit based off of both languages. So they need to, when you're giving a bilingual assessment, an actual bilingual assessment tool is either in English or in Spanish. A total bilingual assessment means that or English and whatever the second language is. A bilingual assessment altogether is going to include formal and informal information about the child's culture, assessments that are given the most appropriate way, and fluency data in the different languages. So one of the ways to decide which test to give is the MAMBI. I introduced the MAMBI over and over again because I do think it is very important. And so this right here, the first thing is that the MAMBI, you develop language profiles. So the first profile is that they are minimal in both languages. Basically, these kids they're alingual, and that would be considered a profile of 1. A profile of 9 means that they're completely fluent in both languages. Both of these are fairly rare. If you have a profile of 1, I'm going to start investigating and thinking about a priori questions like intellectually disabled, because again, the child is completely alingual. And then fluent in both languages usually is something that you'd capture after 3rd grade and after they've had a chance to be exposed to both languages and instruction in both languages. But then you have most kids fall somewhere between 2 and 8. And so one of the things that you have to decide is where are they? Because where they fall, minimal is pretty straightforward. Profile 1, you're going to probably give most of your tests in nonverbally. Profile 9, you could probably give the test in either language or both languages. But what do you focus on between 2 and 8? So this is the next part of the MAMBI. This comes straight out of the Rhodes, Ochoa, and Ortiz text. And so first you determine their grade, so that kind of pale up here. Grades K through 4, and the other option is grades 5 through 7. You have these different profiles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7 and 8 are not listed, and then 9. If you go to the text, for some reason I don't think 7 and 8 are even in there, but I think it's something that you could find out if it was something you want. And then, so you find your profile. So like we were saying, somebody who's completely alingual, for both early grades K through 4 and 5 through 7, nonverbal is the way to go. But you probably also want to get some information for them in their first language and some information for them bilingually. And it doesn't really matter where they are. So the most important test that you're going to get when you're trying to figure out where am I going to put the most weight, what is going to be the best assessment of their abilities, is probably going to be the nonverbal. The other two are supplemental. And then down here, you'll see that a 9, where you have both. Remember, I told you you're probably not going to get it in those early grades, and they've just not even given you an option down there. is that you want to get both their first language and their second language. Both of them are considered equally as important and the primary modes of ability. So you don't care so much about nonverbal. Bilingual might be helpful, but really, if they're equally fluent, it doesn't matter. So this gives you an idea. You first give some sort of language proficiency test for the child and determine where their CALP levels are. You figure out their profile. It goes here. You figure out their grade, right? And then this tells you. So this right here, this chart is just for if they've only received ESOL or ESL. There's more in the MAMBI. There are options for kids who've received bilingual education, which means that, they actually have received language instruction in both English and their other language, and different kinds of ways that that looks. And so, the three things you have to know in order to do the MAMBI: what is their language profile? What grade are they in? And what kind of second language instruction did they receive? And then once you have the MAMBI, it tells you what tests that you should give: English, whatever their first language is, bilingual, or nonverbal. Again, you can give any test you want, but these are the ones that are going to be the most valuable and hold the most weight. So there are some general psychoeducational assessment issues. One of the things you have to look is at the referrals. We talked about this a little earlier. Are there certain groups that are being referred more often than others? You need to make sure that you're considering second language and culture acquisition in terms of cognitive and social emotional development. So things like, if the child is being referred because they don't speak, but we know that a common issue with new immigrants or new kids to a new place is a silent period. You need to understand what this is and that this is a normal developmental process and not not a pathological one. You want to give the right tests. You want to understand that there are problems with tests. Even if you choose the right test, use the MAMBI, you figure out exactly what to give, etc. Even then, those tests are still going to have problems. There's no perfect test ever. That's why we have reliability and validity data on tests. But the reliability of the tests are going to be even less for kids for whom English is not their first language. And then if you absolutely have to, you would adapt existing assessment tools, but you would not be able to use the normative data if you make any changes to it because it's no longer standardized. And you need to very clearly describe in your report any adaptations that you made. So here are some psychometric issues for English language learners. IDEA says your assessment should be selected and administered not to be discriminatory. So this is more of an ideal because, like I just said, you cannot say that there's going to be no discrimination or bias in a test. We know that there's going to be issues with any and all tests. So you're really trying to aim for the least amount of discriminatory, racial, or cultural bias. And you also will sometimes have to weigh more on qualitative data and quantitative data and multiple sources of data so that you are getting the least biased total picture about the child. You're supposed to administer the test in the appropriate language, make sure that the test that you're measuring is valid and reliable for, the scores are reliable, and administered by someone who's trained and knowledgeable. This last one gets really tricky because a lot of times schools will say, well, I'm just going to have, the translator give the test. No, just because that person knows how to speak in both languages doesn't mean they know or should be giving tests. So this trained and knowledgeable personnel means that the school psychologist, regardless of what language they speak, is the holder of the protocol. So validity and tests. So when the child's general background looks different from the ones that were in the standardization pool, then sometimes the norms aren't very useful anymore. And so that's what this is basically saying. It's saying the further your child that you're testing gets from the normative group, the less valid these scores are. And then we talk about test bias. Test bias is when one group systematically performs differently from another group on an instrument. So, we found early test developers, were going out and they were giving tests, and they, old white men basically, they would give these tests and they would find out that white kids did better than anybody else, particularly white male kids were doing better. And they were like, well, that's just because everybody who's not white and male is dumb. Well, no, that's not the case. We have since done tons of research and established that if the person who develops the test thinks that things that are important are things that they're good at, and ignores everything that other people might be good at, then of course people like them are going to perform well and everyone else is going to do worse. It doesn't mean that the test is a construct, is measuring a construct you think it does. What IQ looks like in one group may look a little different for another group. This idea, though, this underlying G, we want to get at G. Subtests and tests of intelligence, they really are, and test of achievement, they really are based off of probes established by, in this country, the majority population for how you demonstrate that this person knows something. So it's not necessarily that the person doesn't know it if they don't demonstrate it the way that you think that they should. And so that's one of the ways that test bias happens. So if a test is biased, it's not reliability that is affected, it's validity. The test is no longer measuring what you think it's measuring. Instead, it's measuring what cultural group the child came from and not necessarily how much they know the content. And then there's certain culturally loaded tests. So things like putting blocks together is going to be a lot less culturally loaded than a vocabulary test. And so that's just something to consider. Bias in testing stems from putting cultural content into the test. Linguistic demands are inherently different. You just don't even have the kids that you're working with in the normative group. You change some sort of thing about the test so it's not standardized anymore. And when you do that, you don't remember that normative tests start easy and end up hard. So if you were to translate a test item, let's say you translate the word car into Spanish, it becomes coche, and you change a 3-letter word to a 5-letter word, and that process makes the word harder to read, but car would come early in a list of reading words, whereas coche would come later. And so here on this next slide, that really gives you an idea. So, you would say car was easy, but there was hard. But over here, su, which is there, and would be easy, and coche would be hard. So this idea that you can just take them and translate them and then everything's the same is incorrect. Verbal and nonverbal bias. Bias in nonverbal tests may occur if the instructions are in English only. So some of the tests will let you have English or Spanish, for instance, responses, but you just ask the questions to the kid in English. And so that may introduce bias. Again, maybe you don't have norms. So this is one of those things that becomes really tricky. So when they developed the original WISC in Spanish, they looked at the US population. They said, I'm making these numbers up because I just don't know. 60% of the folks came from Mexico, 30% of the folks came from Puerto Rico or Cuba, so the Caribbean, and then, they went on from there. And so when they gathered their Spanish-speaking population, they didn't go to the United States and gather, folks from Mexico and folks from Cuba, but lived in the United States. They went out to Cuba. Well, I didn't go to Cuba, but they went to the Caribbean and gathered Spanish speakers in their native country. And they went to Mexico to get Mexican students for that. And they go through and they gathered the data and they were saying, well, we have a representative sample of what Hispanics are like and Spanish speakers are like in the United States because we gathered data on them in these other countries. The problem is that just because the language may be okay, the cultural expectations, educational systems, all those other things are very different. And so you just have to be really careful. When you're working with English language based tests or tests for kids for whom English is not their first language, You need to look at in the technical part of the manual and find out how was this normative data collected, where was this normative data collected, because that original WISC in Spanish would be great if I have a kid who just came over to the United States from another country, but less so if I have a child who was born in the United States but spoke Spanish because that's what they spoke at home. So those are going to be very different Spanish-speaking populations and therefore different norms. So then there's just some other biases, just things that it seems like it would make sense, but you just have to continue to consider. So this is things like in some cultures you teach by demonstrating, and in other cultures you teach by asking questions. Um, so it's bigger than just do they speak English or do they speak Spanish? It's other issues as well.